In 1975, America withdrew from Vietnam after 20 years of war. The country was in ruins, with a shortage of food and medicine. Everyone was suffering, but none caught the sympathies of the West more than the orphans of Saigon. Out of fear for their safety, during the last few weeks of the fall of Saigon, 99 orphans were airlifted out of the city and flown to Heathrow Airport. But this humanitarian effort wasn't organised by the British government or a charity. It was the Daily Mail who took on the challenge. Today, the orphans on that flight are all grown up, many with children of their own. Some went back to Vietnam, while others struggled to find a connection with their country of birth. Nearly 50 years on, I tracked down a handful of them to find out their thoughts on if the Daily Mail's flight was an act of grace,
if I was in Vietnam and the condition I was in, I wouldn't be here talking to you today.
or the biggest publicity stunt of the century.
I think it was probably a slow news time and it would make them look like heroes.
Marines land on the beaches of Da Nang, the first American combat troops to set foot in Vietnam.
So the Vietnam War was what we sometimes call a proxy war, and it was due to the fact that America was trying to stop the spread of communism. And we get into the early 70s, I think there's a realisation that America really can't win it. So the strategy then is to kind of disentangle and remove themselves from the situation as kind of painlessly as possible.
To understand how one of the UK's biggest tabloids found themselves with 99 orphans under their care, you have to go back a few days. On the 2nd of April, America was beginning its withdrawal from Vietnam, to mixed reactions back home.
There is also, though, I suppose, a more conservative view that this was an embarrassment, and this was, as I said before, a humiliation that America was having to leave in the way that it was.
In search of a victory at the end of a brutal war, President Gerald Ford proposed a unique plan.
Money from a $2 million special foreign aid children's fund be made available to fly 2,000 South Vietnamese orphans to the United States as soon as possible.
Correspondent Brian Fremantle was inspired by the operation and pitched to his editor at the Daily Mail the idea of staging their own airlift, and began working with the refugee charity Ockenden Venture to find 100 orphans.
And I think the editor of the Daily Mail thought it would be a good thing to do, and cynically perhaps, there was a news story attached to it. So Ockenden had run some orphanages in Saigon, so they had that connection as well.
With a charity gathering up orphans and a plane secured, the Daily Mail began running stories on the upcoming airlift. But the day before it was meant to take place, tragedy struck the first flight of the American operation.
They were saying that the back end of the airplane was blown out, and we'd lost the hydraulics.
Captain Trainer didn't know it at the time, but the back door of the plane had just been ripped open. Months later, he would find out that one of the screws on the back door had been damaged before it was fitted to the aircraft, and just couldn't handle the forces outside. When it came loose, it severed the controls to half of the plane's engines, and eventually it came down in a rice field just outside of Saigon. Of the 145 children on board, only 67 survived, and one of them, Nikki Green, was just up here.
I was 11 months when I was put on the flight, and because I was really ill, I was put in a hammock up in the troop compartment. I was on oxygen because I was so ill, and the plane depressurised. I was one of the very few people who were reasonably okay because I had my own oxygen supply. And obviously being upstairs in the troop compartment, that's where a majority of the survivors were, because when the plane landed and bellied and broke up, it was the base, the bottom of the plane that most people were killed.
The people who were old enough to remember perished downstairs, and the people who were very, very young, they don't know anything, they don't remember anything.
The first flight of Operation Babylift ended in tragedy, and called into question whether any more should even go ahead. I think in that time of uncertainty where they were still trying to figure out what went wrong, do you think there should have been some hesitance with carrying on with the operation? Or?
Why? It was a totally unrelated activity that caused the accident. Nothing to do with the Babylift mission. Zero. You got a bunch of guys driving to a football game, and one of the cars has a flat tire. Does that mean everybody should stop?
For some people, they say, it's not a football game, it's like children's lives.
Let's back up and make that car run into a cement truck. Okay. And they died. And now all those other people in those other cars, those are lives. I'm telling you that line of thinking is not a reasonable thought process. Of course, there's no relationship between the crash my airplane to the rest of the mission. Zero, nothing, nada.
Regardless, the very next day the Daily Mail flight took off from Saigon. Given her minimal injuries, Nikki Green was put on board and brought to the UK.
I think that it was with good intentions. I think the Daily Mail, they possibly could have done a lot more homework and just taken children that actually wanted to be left.
Nikki was lucky enough to have a family who had already agreed to adopt her before she left Saigon. But for the rest, there was such a rush to gather up orphans to bring to the UK, so many documents were left behind. For most of the people on board the flight, they have no idea if their parents are alive or dead, or if they even consented to having their child flown to the UK. Without the paperwork, there's a slim chance they'd ever be able to track down their biological family.
You know, they just wanted to make themselves look like they were rescuing the kids, and and yes, they did bring us back, but a lot of those people didn't request to be taken out of Vietnam.